The dog was trembling in my arms when I knocked on that door at 12:47 a.m., my knuckles barely making a sound against the wood as if I wasn't sure I deserved an answer. The street behind me was silent, swallowed in the kind of darkness that makes you feel like the whole world has forgotten you exist. I remember thinking that if no one opened the door, I'd probably just sit there on the porch until morning, because somehow, returning this lost dog felt like the last decent thing I had left in me. If you believe that small acts of kindness can change lives, even when everything feels broken, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. You never know whose story might remind you why kindness still matters. His name tag said Benny, though I only found that out after I'd already carried him for nearly a mile. He had muddy paws, a slight limp, and eyes that kept searching my face like he was trying to decide if I was safe. Funny thing was, I wasn't even sure I was safe from myself anymore. Life had a way of pushing me into corners lately, and I'd been making more wrong turns than right ones. Returning a lost dog at midnight wasn't part of any grand plan, it just happened. Or maybe, in some strange way, it was meant to. My name is Caleb Turner, and a week before that night, I lost my job at a warehouse in Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't entirely my fault, but it wasn't entirely innocent either. I'd been distracted, late too often, carrying the weight of unpaid bills and a relationship that had quietly collapsed without much warning. My apartment was already half empty because I had started selling things I once loved just to keep the lights on. Every day felt like I was slipping further behind, like I was running a race I never signed up for. That night, I wasn't even supposed to be out. I had stepped outside just to clear my head, walking aimlessly through quiet neighborhoods where the houses looked warm and complete, everything my life wasn't. That's when I saw Benny. He was sitting near the curb under a flickering streetlight, his body tense, his head darting at every passing sound. There was something about him that made me stop. Maybe it was the way he didn't run when I approached, or maybe it was because I saw a reflection of myself in those anxious, uncertain eyes. He didn't resist when I picked him up. He leaned into me instead, like he'd been waiting. That kind of trust, it hit me harder than I expected. I checked his collar and found an address just a few blocks away. I could have ignored it. I could have convinced myself someone else would take care of it. But for once, I didn't want to walk away. The walk to the house felt longer than it should have. The streets were too quiet, the air too still, like something important was about to happen and the world was holding its breath. When I finally reached the address, I hesitated. The house looked modest but well kept, with a porch light glowing softly like a quiet invitation. My heart started pounding, not because I was scared of returning a dog, but because I felt like I was standing at the edge of something I didn't understand yet. When the door finally opened, it wasn't what I expected. A woman stood there, probably in her early 40s, with tired eyes that seemed to carry years of unspoken stories. Her name, I would later learn, was Rebecca Hayes. In that moment, though, all I saw was the way her expression shifted, from confusion to disbelief to something deeper when she noticed Benny in my arms. It wasn't just relief. It was something heavier, almost overwhelming. She dropped to her knees the second she saw him, pulling him close like she was afraid he might disappear again. There was a kind of silence that filled the air, the kind that says more than words ever could. I stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do, feeling like an outsider witnessing something deeply personal. But then she looked up at me, and everything changed. There was gratitude in her eyes, yes, but also something else. Recognition. Not of who I was, but of something I was carrying. Pain has a way of recognizing itself in others. She invited me in, even though it was past midnight. I hesitated again, because stepping into someone else's life felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous. But something inside me, something I hadn't listened to in a long time, told me to stay. Her house was quiet, almost too quiet. There were pictures on the walls, but many of them seemed older, like memories frozen in time. She made tea, her hand slightly unsteady, and for a while, neither of us said much. It should have been awkward, but it wasn't. It felt necessary. Eventually, she told me the truth. Benny hadn't just gotten lost that night. He had been missing for 3 days. And in those 3 days, Rebecca had barely slept, barely eaten, barely functioned. Because Benny wasn't just a dog, he was the last living connection to her son, Ethan Hayes, who had passed away 2 years earlier in a car accident. The room felt heavier as she spoke, like the walls themselves were listening. She explained how Ethan had adopted Benny from a shelter during his first year of college, how the two of them were inseparable. After Ethan died, Benny became her anchor, her reason to keep going when everything else felt impossible. And then, just like that, he was gone. Until I showed up at her door. I didn't know what to say. There are moments in life when words feel too small, too inadequate for the weight they're supposed to carry. So I just listened. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't the only one struggling to hold things together. Somewhere in that quiet conversation, something shifted inside me. I told her about my job, my apartment, the slow unraveling of my life. I didn't plan to open up, it just happened. Maybe it was the late hour, or maybe it was the way she listened without judgment, like she understood more than I was saying. That night turned into something neither of us expected. What started as a simple act of returning a lost dog became a shared moment of honesty, of vulnerability, of two strangers realizing they weren't as alone as they thought. Before I left, she did something I'll never forget. She handed me a small envelope. I tried to refuse, assuming it was money, but she shook her head gently. Inside was a handwritten note. It said that sometimes, the people who feel the most lost are the ones who end up guiding others home. And at the bottom, she had written an address, the location of a community center she volunteered at. She told me they needed help. Not just workers, but people who understood what it meant to struggle. I didn't think much of it at the time. I walked back into the cold night, feeling different but not entirely sure why. But the next morning, something strange happened. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely hopeless. I went to that address. And that decision changed everything. The community center wasn't anything fancy, but it was alive in a way my life hadn't been for a long time. People came in and out, families, kids, individuals carrying their own invisible battles. I started small, just helping with basic tasks, but slowly, I found myself connecting with people in ways I hadn't expected. Weeks turned into months. I found purpose again. Rebecca and I stayed in touch, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, steady way that real connections grow. Benny would greet me every time I visited, his tail wagging like he remembered that night as clearly as I did. Looking back now, it's hard to believe how close I was to giving up on everything. And how something as simple as returning a lost dog led me to a place where I finally felt like I belonged. If this story has touched your heart even a little, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Stories like these remind us that even in our darkest moments, something, or someone, can lead us back to the light. And before we reach the end, I have a special request. Comment, kindness finds a way, if you believe even the smallest good deed can change a life. Because I'm living proof that it can. That night didn't just change Rebecca's life by bringing Benny home. It saved mine too.